Hello and welcome. My name is Amelia Nelson, and I'm the Director of the Library and Archives here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. And today I am pleased you could join us for Behind the Scenes, Discovering Missouri's Artist. In this program, we're providing a preview of the Missouri Remembers Artists in Missouri through 1951 website, which documents Missouri artists and will launch soon. This project is a collaborative initiative between the Kansas City Art Institute, Janus Library, the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, Spencer Art Reference Library, and the St. Louis Public Library, and is supported by generous funding from the Missouri Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Although the idea of creating a resource documenting Missouri's artists has been in the air for a long time, it was really Michael Sweeney's coordination of Missouri's bicentennial through the State Historical Society of Missouri that pushed this idea to an initiative. The arts have played such an important role in the state's history, and yet to date, there wasn't a resource that was dedicated to documenting Missouri's artists throughout the state's history. Instead, this information was spread across the state in libraries, in archives, with individuals, and as part of other publications. NEH funding allowed each of the project partners institutions to hire researchers who, in collaboration with library staff, have spent the last year mining their collections of artist files, archival documentation, and publications to create the records for each artist included in the Missouri Remembers website. When the portal launches, anyone will be able to explore Missouri's artists, see examples of their work, and make connections to the places the artists called home and the communities they were a part of. We're proud that you'll not only discover Missouri's iconic artists like Thomas Hart Benton or George Caleb Bingham, but you'll also artists from underrepresented communities, including women, artists of color, and self-taught artists. Today, you're going to get a preview of some of the exciting discoveries that the project's researchers have made while doing this work, about the little-known connections to Missouri of internationally celebrated artists, the galleries and organizations that exhibited and promoted Missouri's artists, as well as some of the connections between artists whose stories bring this initiative to life. Before we get started, I do have some very brief housekeeping. We'll have time at the end of today's program for questions, but throughout the program today, you're welcome to include your questions in the chat, which I will be monitoring. Today's first presenter is Chris Impastato, Site Supervisor and Fine Arts Senior Subject Specialist at the St. Louis Public Library. She will be presenting on the People's Art Center Association of St. Louis.
Thank you, Amelia. So the St. Louis research team has been actively delving into a number of arts organizations through our research for our artists that we've been working on. And so this has allowed us to gain a better understanding of the art scene and also the artist involvement in St. Louis through 1951. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on the People's Art Center of St. Louis and provide you with an overview of this organization. The images that I'm using in the presentation, as Amelia said earlier, we've been mining all of our collections for the last year. These images are going to be from the St. Louis Artist files and print resources, as well as the People's Art Association's archival collection, and they're all held here at Central Library. So to start with, I wanted to ask a few big questions. So what's the story behind the People's Art Center? How did this agency come to St. Louis? And how did this community arts organization impact St. Louisans? This arts organization brought together artists and the children of St. Louis to provide instructional art classes for St. Louisans, as well as the surrounding area in the early 1940s. And it was an opportunity to create a community-based art center for all races. Initially, it was funded by the WPA, federally funded, and then it was continually bolstered by private and community donations. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a bit about developing community support, and all organizations need that to move forward. So early on, in around 1941, there was an announcement that came out that an art center was coming to St. Louis. So there were a number of meetings that were planned in the city, and this was all in support of trying to gain community buy-in, raise awareness, and more support. By the spring of 1941, letters were sent out to artists and the public who basically had a known interest in supporting social welfare. And the clipping on the left-hand side talks about an organizational meeting that was held at the Pine Street YMCA. And just to give you a little background on that, that location was a very popular meeting place in the African American community, and it was located in the heart of the Mill Creek Valley neighborhood. The broadside on the right-hand side says, "I'm not preaching." And this is capturing the momentum for this new idea that's been brought to St. Louis. And it's advertising this meeting that's going to be held in May of 1941 at the Metropolitan AME Zion Church, which is located at Garrison and Lucas. And at this meeting, we had federal representation. So we had Holder Cahill, who was National Director of the federal WPA arts programs. He came from Washington, D.C. He presented this plan for this art center, discussed the initial federal funding, and he spoke all about the value of community art centers. And there was a large crowd there, and there was much enthusiasm. At the end of the meeting, a collection was taken and pledges for support to the center were made. Next slide. So in 1942, the center officially opened for art classes, and they started the center at a building at 2811 Washington Boulevard and Leffingwell. This building had earlier belonged to the Episcopal Church of the Holy Communion. So we have this initial funding coming in by the WPA, and we also have volunteer contributions coming in and volunteer workers on the scene. And then by early 1943, the congressional funds were withdrawn, and this left the center scrambling for its existence. But by 1944, there was a number of prominent St. Louisans that cared about this idea and wanted to see this continue. Agnes Baer was one of those. Agnes Friedman Baer was an artist in St. Louis, and she decided to establish a tribute to her late husband, Harold M. Baer. So it was the Harold M. Baer Fund. And then along the way, we started receiving other funding from the good people of St. Louis, from numerous community members. A notable one would be Mrs. Irma Rombauer, and she was author of The Joy of Cooking, which was first published in 1931. Rombauer then continued to be involved in the People's Art Center, eventually serving on the board of directors. Here we see on this slide, we see a listing of local artist involvement. The center drew from significant artists that were here in St. Louis. We have Oscar Thallinger. He was the registrar at the City Art Museum. Houston Chandler was an art teacher at Bashan High School. Fred Alston is also on the list. He was a former art instructor at Sumner High School. We have the notable Fred Conway. We also have the mother-daughter team of Amy Schweig and Martial. And we have numerous other active artists that represented all of St. Louis. Also on the right-hand side, you'll see a clipping from the St. Louis Star-Times, and this is just announcing the class registration. In the center, you get a sense, this is from a flyer, just telling us about the backgrounds of most of our faculty. And a lot of the faculty did come from Washington University, which would be a popular institution in St. Louis, educated a number of our artists here. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So arts and crafts for everybody. By 1945, the Art Center went ahead and left its Washington Boulevard location, and it moved to Midtown, to Grandel Square. This building was purchased, and then with help of the WPA workers and volunteers, they converted the building into classrooms and also created gallery space. The sculpture classes were taught in the carriage house out back. In 1945, another boost came to the organization as it became a member of the Greater St. Louis Community Chest, and this was a forerunner of the United Way. This gave the organization credibility and, most importantly, funding to continue meeting the artistic needs of the community. As you can see on our center image, there were a number of different types of classes that were offered, a wide variety. For adults, weaving and music and clay modeling and sculpture. And then for after school and Sunday morning classes or Saturday morning classes were offered for the youth, wood and metal crafts, painting and drawing. There are two examples on this slide of artwork that were created by students that were used to advertise the People's Art Center. So we have the Children Rainbow artwork, which is from a leaflet that promotes the first children's art exhibition shortly after opening in 1942. And then our Merry Christmas, Happy New Year postcard was created in 1947. It's just once again important to note that People's Art Center, as well as teaching classes to children and adults, also offered that gallery space and to feature student art and also faculty solo exhibitions and joint exhibitions. And then they also sponsored traveling national artists. Let's go to the next slide. So historically referred to as an interracial arts organization, the People's Art Center served people. It served the children and the adults of the city of St. Louis. And it was providing them with arts and crafts for everyone from 1942 through the early 1960s. I'm going to close with a quote that is from the Design and Democracy leaflet. And it talks about how that the center was conceived as a medium of self-expression for those persons of talent and imagination who might otherwise have found no avenue for artistic development. And then the bottom quote was given during the dedication, which was held at the Sheldon Memorial. And the essence of this basically says, art is a basic essential of democracy. So thanks for listening to learn a bit more about the People's Art Center of St. Louis.
Thank you, Chris. Staying in St. Louis, our next presenter is John Knutson. He's the research intern at the St. Louis Public Library and is going to share what he's learned about the Vanguard Gallery and the artists who were associated with it.
Thank you, Amelia. The Vanguard Gallery, as the name suggests, was at the Vanguard. It was an incredibly important politically and socially progressive art venue in St. Louis, primarily in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So some incredibly active years, basically spanning between the Great Depression and the New Deal and leading up to World War II. And the gallery hosted a very diverse range of artists who grappled with some of these national issues, but were also really engaged with the St. Louis community and region as well. So the Vanguard Gallery was founded in 1936 by Artist Jones, who you see pictured here, and who was sort of the main protagonist of the gallery, along with artist Donald McKenzie and the wealthy art patron Elizabeth Green, who was also an important supporter of the People's Art Center, which Chris just talked about. The gallery and its founders were affiliated with the American Artists Congress, which was an anti-fascist arts organization. And from its founding, the stated aim of the gallery was to exhibit contemporary art having social significance. And on this slide, I've included just an interesting artifact from our collection from the first exhibition at the Vanguard Gallery. This is an invitation. On here, you can see the address on Franklin Avenue, which the gallery no longer exists at that address anymore. But also the first exhibition, which you can see the title of here, was an exhibit of graphic art against war and fascism. So a little bit more on Joe Jones. He was sort of the initial driving force behind the Vanguard Gallery. He was born in St. Louis in 1909, and his career really took off when he met Elizabeth Green, who really became his primary patron and lifelong friend. Green paid for Jones to go to Massachusetts and study at the Provincetown Art Colony, which is where he was first introduced to progressive ideologies and was introduced to works by thinkers like Marx, in addition to continuing his art studies in that location. And this idea of the art colony, just as an aside, was actually a really popular idea around this time, and it kind of promoted this more communal idea of art, particularly among progressive artists. So that's a theme that you will see reappear in several of these artists who were affiliated with the Vanguard Gallery. But Jones became a leader in the American Artists Congress and returned to St. Louis, where he began engaging politics more in his work. He opened a free art studio intended for unemployed students at the old courthouse in St. Louis, with about 50-50 white and Black enrollment, which was sort of astounding for that time at the 1930s to have that sort of integrated art program. And just this news article here on the right describes an incident where Jones, after he became labeled as this communist artist, was actually, his class was evicted from the old courthouse. And that just kind of, is an image of the kind of opposition that Jones met in St. Louis. So now I'd like to talk about a few of the lesser known artists from our project who were affiliated with the Vanguard Gallery. So the first of these was Beverly Singer. Burr is short for Bernice. And Singer was born in St. Louis in 1912, so really kind of a contemporary of Jones. But she studied at the Taos Art Colony in New Mexico with the American artist Walter Ufer. Like Jones, Singer was a member of the American Artists Congress, and one of her first major solo exhibitions was at the Vanguard Gallery in 1937, which is this article on this slide is an announcement of that exhibition. And sorry, Amelia, could you advance to the next slide? I'm sorry, I didn't include that. But what is interesting about Singer's work is that she was primarily a portrait artist, and her main subjects were Black St. Louisans, which is sort of unusual at this time. And her paintings really often carried social and political themes. And I find this image here on the left, it's a painting titled War Bride, to be a really great example of that, where you see this young Black bride. It was painted in 1943, right in the middle of the World War. And so you kind of get to see those, those after effects of war and the trauma that derives from that. The second artist I'll talk about is Helen Louise Becker. And Becker participated in the exhibition of Midwestern artists at the Vanguard Gallery in 1936, which was a major exhibition actually in St. Louis at the time, and had previously been shown at the American Contemporary Artists Gallery in New York. While she was educated at the St. Louis School of Fine Arts, Becker was also associated with members of the St. Genevieve Art Colony near St. Louis, and also taught there during the summers, so another art colony. Becker was also involved with the American Artists Congress, and she was both a painter and a printmaker. And you can see just a couple of examples of her work on this slide. She was considered a regionalist, similar to Jones, and focused primarily on scenes of St. Louis, particularly in her later career, often depicting workers and laborers. And the print that you see on the left of this slide is entitled WPA Workers on Monument Creek. So just another tie into that sort of New Deal era. And finally, the last artist I'd like to talk about is Alexandria Corsicoff Galston, who really has been one of my favorite artists to research so far. Unlike Jones, Singer, or Becker, Galston was not born in the United States. Actually, she was originally from the Crimean Peninsula, which in 1884 was still part of the Russian Empire. But she immigrated to the US in 1928 and also participated in that 1936 Midwest Artist Show along with Becker. Galston stands out because in addition to painting, she was also a craftsperson and a folk artist. In fact, she was the first instructor in batik at St. Louis University, which batik is a technique of wax resist dyeing. And you can see here on the image on the right, Galston with one of her batiks. And she also did metalwork. And you can see on the left, I find this article really kind of really entertaining. It's an image of Galston at work at a torpedo factory in 1943. So putting her metalwork to use in the war effort. Galston established her own studio in the 1950s called the Blue Stair Studio, and would host shows featuring local craftsmen and painters and many of the same artists who were involved with the Vanguard Gallery. So the Blue Stair Studio really became part of that circle of artists. But her work was not limited to craft work and folk art. She also did paintings that really revealed the horrors of war. And in 1969, she mounted an exhibition at the Spanish International Pavilion, which is the building that you see here, of her impressions of the war in Vietnam. And unfortunately, we don't have any images of those paintings, but it just shows you kind of her concerns with these international conflicts. And that exhibition was part of a cycle of exhibitions at this venue that really engaged these international themes. And it's interesting, just a word on the venue is sort of an interesting piece of history. It was originally built for the 1964 World's Fair in New York and relocated in 1969 to St. Louis. So it became a venue for a lot of these different artists. So that concludes my segment. I hope you enjoyed hearing about the Vanguard Gallery and a few of the artists who exhibited there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Moving across the state, Roberta Wagner, project researcher and access services specialist at the Spencer Art Reference Library at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, is presenting on the artist Miriam Kitty and the Kansas City Society of Artists.
Hello, I'm Roberta Wagner from the Nelson-Atkins Museum. I'm the specialist in access services, and I've been a project researcher for the project. I'm going to talk about Miriam Kitty. She was an artist active in Kansas City in the 1920s and the 1930s. Beginning in 1920 and until 1929, she was its registrar at the Kansas City Art Institute and maintained a studio in Kansas City. Her first studio was in the Lighton Studio building at 1718 Holly. Later, she moved her studio to Westport at 331 Westport Avenue. In her studio, she gave private art lessons to students. In her work, Kitty made paintings, drawings, and watercolors. This image you see on the screen on the left is entitled The Flattened Hills and Towns of the Ozarks. It's a gouache over chalk on green paper, and it's in the collection here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum in Kansas City. In 1930, Kitty was one of the first artists to make views of landscapes of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri from an airplane. So they're like overhead views of landscape. And her paintings and watercolors were exhibited at the Vanguard Galleries in New York in an exhibition entitled Airplane Impressions. And I included this image because it's similar to images that she showed at this exhibition, but I'm not sure if it was actually a part of it. Kitty was also part of organizing the early years of the Plaza Art Fair, which is a major art event here in Kansas City in the fall. The first fair was in 1932, and Kitty was the manager of the fair. According to the Kansas City Star, the first Plaza Art Fair was inspired by earlier art fairs held in Chicago and New York, and they were designed to help artists sell their work. This is during the Depression in the 1930s, and they were trying to find ways to sell their work to the public, usually for less money than through a gallery. Anyway, in later years in the 1930s, after the Kansas City Society of Artists was no longer involved, Kitty continued to manage the fair. She's mentioned in a news article in 1938, as late as 1938, as the manager of the art fair. Next slide. So these two images on the left-hand side of the screen, the first one is called Shiny Water and it's from Rockport, it was made in Rockport, Massachusetts, and it's an example of her watercolors that she made. The piece next to it, Men Pruning Trees Around Pond from 1934, is an example of work made around the same time as when Kibbe participated in the Public Works of Art project. In 1933 to 34, Kibbe participated in the Public Works of Art project. This is the first government relief program to assist artists during the Great Depression. This was administered through the US Treasury Department, and it was part of the Civil Works Administration, which is the predecessor of the WPA. So it was the first federal relief program for artists. The participating artists were tasked with creating works of art to embellish public buildings under the general theme of the American scene. The artists were able to work in whatever medium they liked and create whatever they wanted. So this piece, Men Pruning Trees Around Pond, is an example of work from that period of time. Kibbe was also a part of WPA projects here in Kansas City. In 1936, Kibbe was the supervisor of a mural project for the library in Southeast High School, which was being newly constructed. The theme of the mural was the characters from the novels of Mark Twain, and they were depicted in a frieze on the library's 75-foot wall. She was assisted in this project by Roland Thomas, another local artist, and by 4 other artists. On the far right-hand side of the screen is an etching called On Sunday Morning. Kibbe exhibited this etching at the 1939 New York World's Fair in the America Today exhibition. According to this newspaper article, this print was selected for acquisition for the Library of Congress. So it went directly from New York City to Washington, D.C. Around the same, during her career, Kibbe also showed her work in other national exhibitions, such as the Society of Independent Artists in New York City in 1924 and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in the same year. So if you go on to the next screen. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the Kansas City Society of Artists, which was an organization that Kibbe and many of our other artists belonged to here in Kansas City. It was an artist organization that was incorporated in 1923 with 16 charter members here in Kansas City. The purpose of the society was to promote the appreciation of the fine arts in Kansas City, and most of the founding members were associated with the Kansas City Art Institute. In the beginning, membership of the society was limited to artists working in oil or watercolor painting, sculpture, or etchings. New members were admitted to the society after they exhibited their work in 2 exhibitions where participants were selected by a jury. So you didn't get into the society unless your work had been in an exhibit and approved by a jury. The headquarters for the society at first were at the Kansas City Art Institute. Then after 1929, it was at Gertrude Leighton's Leighton Studio, which is the building you see in the image on the left-hand side of the screen. That was located at one time at 1718 Holly Street in the West Bottoms here in Kansas City. This building was a center for artist studios, and in the sub-basement of the building, there was a tea room where they had social events. It was used as artist studios until 1942, when Gertrude Leighton moved her studio to 4890 Main Street. The building was revived as artist studios in the 1950s, and unfortunately, it was destroyed in a fire in 1962, so it's no longer there. In 1934, the society opened a public art gallery in downtown Kansas City at 1010 Walnut Street. At the downtown gallery, the work of a member of the society was exhibited every 2 weeks as a solo exhibition. So each member got their own exhibition for 2 weeks at this downtown gallery. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some of our artists in our database who were involved with the society. Can you move on to the next slide, Amelia? Amelia? Okay. All right. So the Kansas City Society of Artists wasn't just they also held exhibitions and social events. In the 1920s, the society held 2 annual exhibitions, one in April and one in October. The annual exhibition was held in April, and then the sweepstakes exhibition was in October. In November, they held a thumb box exhibition where the works were exhibited were limited to 10 by 12 inches. So they had to be small paintings. This exhibition was held until 1933 when the members voted to increase the size of works in the November exhibition to larger paintings. In 1926, the society began offering associate memberships, which granted it all the privileges of membership except for exhibiting anyway, the society also had a social function. They hosted parties and social events for the members. On the screen, you can see some of the details of these things. They held teas with discussions about the arts, dinners and parties at members' homes, lectures, sketch classes, art demonstrations. They also had things like costume parties and holiday parties. At the teas, they had, along with exhibitions of their work, they also had like a discussions about art, or sometimes they'll have a musical program with other musicians. And from my research, it seems like those are maybe like classical music. At least that's the thing, the feeling I get from it. They also met regularly with other organizations, such as the Missouri Writers Guild, things like that. So, so that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Roberta. Moving on to just across the street, Laura Farrell, Site Supervisor, Catalog and Digital Services Librarian at the Janus Library at the Kansas City Art Institute, will present on two artists with strong KC connections.
Thanks, Amelia. So the first artist I would like to talk about is Janet Turner. When we first began to work on the Missouri Remembers project, the first question was, who were the artists in Missouri? And what information do we have on these people here in our archive and our library collection? We began by harvesting names from some of our historic resources. The college has some material on the early history of the college. Our most frequently referred to book is a title by Maisie Bush Owens on Kansas City Art Institute history, A History of Community Achievement, 1885 to 1964, was a perfect resource due to its overlap with our time frame and the history of the specific region that was discussed. In harvesting names, I had no idea what the stories were behind these brief mentions. So you can see here on the slide, this is just one page out of A History of Community Achievement that's full of names of people involved in the history of the Art Institute. One person could be one of many names on a given page, and there was always a chance that we might find very little documentation on that person. And yeah, thank you. That is why Janet Turner jumped out at me as an artist. To my surprise, not only did I find that this former Kansas City Art Institute student was well documented, but she was also a master of her craft and had a museum named after her, holding her collection of prints that she had accumulated over her lifetime. Janet Turner was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1914. She was raised in Missouri, and then she attended Stanford in California, majoring in biology. She graduated from Stanford in 1936, and clearly her knowledge of nature is apparent in her art. After graduating from Stanford, she actually returned to Kansas City and attended the Kansas City Art Institute, majoring in art. She attended KCAI from 1937 until 1940, and she studied with famous artists Thomas Hart Benton and John DeMartelli. She continued her studies, attending Claremont Graduate School in California and earning an MFA in 1947. And she later attended Columbia University Teachers College, receiving her PhD in 1960. In addition to being an artist, Janet Turner taught in Texas as well as California. In California, she established the printmaking program at California State University at Chico, where she was also awarded Outstanding Professor. She donated her print collection to the university, establishing the Janet Turner Print Collection. Her prints reflect her astute observations of nature, while also demonstrating her knowledge of art history, including Japanese woodblock prints. Some of her work reminds me of the landscapes and nature prints of Albrecht Dürer. Janet Turner participated in many exhibitions, including the American Artist Show in 1940 of Thomas Hart Benton's students' work. She was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1952. And excuse me, her prints and paintings have been exhibited in every state and in 50 countries on 6 continents, including those in 17 cities in Japan and 3 cities in Israel. Her major group exhibitions in the United States include the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the New York World's Fair in 1964 and 65, and the National Academy of Design in New York. Another artist that stood out to me while doing this project was that of Aaron Douglas. Aaron Douglas was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas. He was born in 1899, and he was an African-American painter, illustrator, and art educator who worked closely with other Black artists and activists. He was a pioneering and major figure in American art. Douglas was an art instructor at Lincoln High School in Kansas City, Missouri in the 1920s. Aaron Douglas was born in Topeka, Kansas, where he attended the integrated Topeka High School from 1914 until 1917. He was one of only 8 African Americans in his graduating class. His pursuit of art began at a young age as he designed the cover of his high school yearbook in Topeka in both 1915 and 1917. You can see the cover of the yearbook from 1915 right there on the left. From high school, he then attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, graduating in 1922 with a bachelor's degree in fine arts. Excuse me. He also took classes at the University of Kansas. He then taught at Lincoln High School in Kansas City, Missouri, where he grew the art club to over 70 students. In this slide, this photo on the left is from the Black Archives of Mid-America, and it shows Lincoln High School where Aaron Douglas taught in the 1920s. And this is its location just west of the Paseo by about 3 blocks. I put a little star on the map there showing where Lincoln High School was in the 1920s. It was a high school for African-American students, and Tracy, the street that it was on, is just a few blocks west of the historic Paseo. Aaron Douglas was an activist and inspired by the influential Black intellectuals, including Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois. Aaron Douglas moved to Harlem in New York City. In 1926, he published the magazine Fire. You can see the cover there on the right, with collaborators that include Langston Hughes, who was also from the Midwest, and Zora Neale Hurston. During this period, Douglas was awarded a Barnes Foundation Fellowship to study modernist paintings and African art. He also created murals, including at Club Ebony in Harlem, at Fisk University in Tennessee, and in Chicago and North Carolina. In the mid-1930s, he was commissioned by the Public Works Administration to paint the acclaimed cycle Aspects of Negro Life for the County Cullen branch of the New York Public Library. That branch is actually now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. The series of panels for Aspects of Negro Life depict adversity and hope in the history of the Black experience in America. Douglas embraced African iconography and never shied away from directly addressing both the negative and the positive aspects of the Black experience. He was also highly involved with Harlem artists and was elected the president of the Harlem Artists Guild in 1935, which was the same year that the guild was formed. He was twice awarded the Rosenwald Foundation for Travel Fellowship in the 1930s, where he was able to travel to the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and the American South studying art. In the late 1930s, Douglas began teaching at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a leading African-American university in the United States. He founded the art department at Fisk and was chair there for 29 years. He continued to travel and was frequently in New York until his death in Nashville in 1979.
Thank you, Laura. Our final presentation today will be by Eleanor Noyes. Eleanor is the research intern at the Kansas City Art Institute, and she will be presenting on JesseHoward from Fulton, Missouri.
Hi, everyone. As Amelia said, my name is Eleanor Noyes. I'm a research intern at the Kansas City Art Institute. Today, I'll be talking about JesseHoward, a self-taught artist who created thousands of provocative signs declaring his beliefs about religion, politics, and the meaning of life. JesseHoward grew up in rural Missouri at the turn of the 20th century, witnessing firsthand the life-changing effects of industrialization. But he didn't begin making art until the 1950s, after retiring from a long career as a farmer, railroad worker, and handyman. Using archival sources discovered through research from Missouri Remembers, this presentation will analyze the context that shaped JesseHoward, his work, and his legacy. JesseHoward was born the youngest of 9 siblings on July 4th, 1885. His parents owned a farm in Fulton, Missouri, which meant that he and his siblings spent 9 months working and only 3 months in school. The upper left photograph shows the Howard family in the mid-1890s, a few years before their mother's death in 1899. By 1900, Howard had decided to travel west across the United States in search of temporary work on farms and railroads. He returned to Fulton several years later and married Maud Litton. The couple purchased their own farm and settled down to raise 5 children. Howard earned roughly $1.50 a day as a farmer and supplemented his income by renovating old houses. He fought in both world wars and lived through the Great Depression before beginning his career as an artist. During the 1940s, 2 major things changed the course of JesseHoward's life. First, he began helping a man named Ed Peacock host weekly shows of industrial farming equipment. The photo on the left shows them together with an antique tractor. The experience inspired Howard to transform his own property into a place where tourists could appreciate handcrafted objects. Second, Howard was influenced by the anti-communist propaganda that spread after World War II. In 1946, Winston Churchill spoke in Howard's hometown to warn Americans of the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe, potentially spreading communism around the world. Howard hoped that his work could warn the public of political corruption while reinforcing positive lessons from the Bible. The help of his wife's job at a shoe factory, JesseHoward retired to fully devote himself to transforming his farm into a biblical wonderland. Among his first creations were 7 burial mounds for holy figures, a replica of Haman's gallows, and a cart hand-lettered with quotes from the Book of Job as seen on the right. Howard's early work was whimsical and lighthearted. He sculpted model airplanes and painted animals across old farming equipment. Using a Bible, a farmer's almanac, and a dictionary, he carefully chose words of wisdom to accompany each sculpture. Yet the town of Fulton did not appreciate his efforts. He was scorned and harassed by locals who perceived his creations as bizarre. After repeated burglaries and the destruction of his model airplanes, Howard began to speak more directly to his neighbors. JesseHoward made his first sign to publicly accuse the vandals who destroyed his work and the Fulton police who did nothing about it. Frustrated by the lack of concern shown by the community, he expounded on the town's injustices, eventually covering his entire fence with hand-lettered polemics. Armed with the daily newspaper, he crafted razor-sharp commentary about local officials, current events, and other sources of outrage. Public relations continued to worsen to the point that a group of neighbors petitioned for Howard to be committed to the state insane asylum, narrowly failing for lack of signatures. It wasn't until JesseHoward was 83 years old that perception of his work began to change. In 1968, an artist named Greg Blasdell visited Howard to include him in his article, The Grassroots Artist, published in Art in America. A few years later, his work was exhibited at the Walker Art Center in Naives and Visionaries, one of the first formal exhibitions of folk and outsider art held in Minneapolis. As Howard's notoriety grew through the 1970s, faculty from the Kansas City Art Institute began regularly visiting him to conduct interviews and collect his work. In 1977, they held a solo exhibition of more than 100 of his signs and sculptures at the Corsicoff Gallery in Kansas City. Howard continued to receive waves of visitors from far and wide, gladly obliging each with a private tour of his studios and sprawling property. JesseHoward was discovered by an art world that had emerged from the academic debates of modernism into the wide open terrain of conceptual, performance, and environment-based art. Unlike Howard's neighbors in Fulton, this international audience was intrigued by his bold constructions and status as an outsider, both to the art world and to his own community. Critics could connect Howard's work to painters like Cy Twombly, who incorporated handwritten text in paintings, and sculptors like David Smith, who created abstract assemblages using found machine parts. Howard's rural background also helped align him with the image of the self-alienated artist genius, embodied by icons like Jackson Pollock. As an artist fueled by the desire to record his own existence, JesseHoward's signs captured not only his own history, but the histories through which he lived. His work is filled with fragments of the people and places that surrounded him, from the Missouri countryside of his childhood to the community in Fulton that rejected him, to the Midwestern art world that finally embraced and celebrated his work. After his death in 1983, most of JesseHoward's signs were removed by collectors before his home and studios were bulldozed for redevelopment. Today, his work is preserved by over a dozen major museums and countless private residences. Howard has continued to receive prestigious exhibitions at venues including H&R Block Art Space in Kansas City and the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. His unique trajectory demonstrates the power of art to project the voices of outsiders through articles, exhibitions, and permanent collections. Through these platforms, Howard's signs continue to speak, their messages resonating in new and unexpected ways with the text-based culture of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. All of the artists and organizations that you've heard about today will be included in the Missouri Remembers portal, which is we're planning to launch in the next few weeks. To learn more about updates and upcoming programs, please visit the webpage that I am entering in the chat, but you can also just type Missouri Remembers Nelson-Atkins and you'll also be taken to this webpage. I do want to, we'll have time for questions, but I do want to make a few thank yous. Definitely thank you to all of the presenters today and all of our project partners who have worked so tirelessly on this project. There are also so many people and organizations who have supported this project that it's hard to thank everyone, but I would like to specifically recognize our advisory board members who have provided invaluable insight throughout the project. Dr. Madeline Rislow, who is assistant professor and director of the art history program at Missouri Western State University. Dr. Carmeletta Williams, who is executive director at the Black Archives of Mid-America in Kansas City. And Dr. Stephanie Knapp, who is the Samuel Soslan Curator of American Art here at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. I would also like to thank Sam Blaine, who is an independent researcher who is passionate about Missouri and its artists, and he has generously allowed the project team to integrate his research on Missouri artists into the portal. And so at this time, I'm going to go over to our chat. We've had a few questions come in throughout the presentation for our presenters today. The first one I'm going to go back to is about the Community Arts Center. So for you, Chris. Oh, and I guess Chris answered in the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and pose the question for anyone who hasn't seen it. Let me go ahead and scroll back up here. Were community art centers like the one in St. Louis unusual for the time, or were there other examples in Missouri that were also funded by the WPA, or was the St. Louis model echoed anywhere else in the United States?
There I am. Basically, this community art center idea had gained traction around the United States. And during this time in 1942, this is the first, the People's Art Center in St. Louis was the first federally funded art center in Missouri. And at that time, I found information that indicated there were around 91 centers across the country. The quote in my last slide where I talked about the design for democracy, the woman who gave the talk at the dedication, she was the head of a similar art center in Cleveland. So they specifically to help celebrate.
Thank you. I think this is a general question posed for anyone who wants to answer. What were some of the biggest challenges you encountered in researching the various topics presented today? What destroyed, lost evidence would have been most helpful to you to still have access for your research?
I can address that one from my perspective here. I think one of the biggest challenges, honestly, in this research is that we have targeted artists who are a little less known. So we're not looking at the George Caleb Binghams, those really well-known Missouri artists. So a lot of times there's not a lot of published material on these artists. We have some core resources that we consult, but often it's kind of piecing together these histories with artifacts that we find in our collection. So kind of combing through a lot of newspaper clippings to identify particularly exhibitions that people have been involved in. So a lot of this we're kind of piecing together for ourselves, which is also, I think, what is really exciting about the project is finding these new characters to involve.
We have chosen lesser known artists, which is what is so wonderful about it. I will say that there are some people that I haven't been able to include because historically, when people would document at the time anything about a woman, they often refer to her as Mrs. Kohler, and they would refer to her by her husband's name. So there are some people where I tried to find out the woman's first name, and I knew that she possibly taught ceramics at the Kansas City Art Institute, but I only ever saw her referred to as Mrs. Louis Kohler. And there's no thread sometimes historically to pull when if you don't have the first and last name. So we're trying really hard to not allow women to be lost to history, but the way that people were referred to at the time can really affect your ability to find out anything about them.
Thank you, Laura. There's another question here. Does the Kansas City Society of Artists still exist? I think that's for you, Roberta.
Yeah, I was going to mention this in my presentation, that I accidentally left it out, I think. Yeah, in 1937, the society was dissolved by a vote of the members. So no, it unfortunately no longer exists. And I wasn't able to find out why they dissolved the society. But I know their last president, Anna Allenbach, she left Kansas City, moved to Cleveland. And then the next president was a guy named Walter Alexander Bailey, who was also a staff member at the Kansas City SAR in their art department. So yeah, they dissolved they disbanded in 1937. So.
Thank you. There's another good question here, which kind of looks at the foundations of the projects. Did you find that artists examined for this project thought of themselves as Missouri artists? What was their connection? Was their connection to the state important to them? And I can kind of start with this one, and then anybody can add. We struggled with this, who is a Missouri artist? And we kind of, as a project team, decided that artists who practiced in the state for were active artistically in the state for 3 years, we would consider a Missouri artist. Some of our artists, they were very much tied to their identity as a Missouri artist. And some of the artists, moved several times, were very nomadic, and, they may have been tied to Missouri because they had a significant work that they completed here, or they had family ties here. So that was a difficult decision for the group, but we landed on, they had to have been active in Missouri for 3 years.
And I'll just add on to that. It's a great question. And I find there are probably a couple of categories as I'm looking at different artists. There are people who really started their career in St. Louis. And, like the St. Louis School of Fine Arts educated so many artists around this time. And then they went off to other parts of the country. So we really get to look at their kind of early careers here. And then there were people who were really attracted to St. Louis at particular moments in time. Like, I talked about sort of this politically active group. A lot of people were attracted to those sorts of organizations. So there are a couple of different categories I feel that, Missouri artists fall into.
Yeah, that's a good addition. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
And I just wanted to share one thing in the research for the People's Arts Center. E. Sims Campbell, or Elmer Sims Campbell, a Black artist, well-known cartoonist, spent his early years in St. Louis, then went on to great career outside of St. Louis, but he always kept the connection with St. Louis and always identified with Missouri. In fact, when the People's Arts Center was opened, after they opened the Arts Center, he had the first exhibit there. So that was his gift to coming back to St. Louis. So he never forgot about Missouri and forgot about St. Louis. So the connection was still strong with Sims Campbell.
Well, I'm going to read one more question here, which is a perfect way to close out today's program. There's a question: is there a way to contribute to this website if I have information about a Missouri artist? That is one of our ulterior motives about sharing the portal and our work in this way. We're absolutely hoping that we connect to people who have information about Missouri artists. That website that I shared in the chat, which is just if you type into Google Missouri Remembers Nelson-Atkins, you'll land on a page that will share upcoming programs. There's also a contact us link, and you can submit information on artists that you may know about. We'll also post when the portal goes live. That's where we'll share that information in addition to all of the partner institutions' social media platforms. I would like to thank all the presenters today, and especially everyone who took time out of their day and their lunch to join us. We're really excited about this project and about being able to share Missouri's artists with you soon. Thank you.